"Excuse me, ma'am. Are you sure you're in the right section?" The thinly veiled disdain in his voice hung in the air, thick as the perfume of privilege. Eleanor's boarding pass clearly stated first class, but his eyes, scanning her from head to toe, said otherwise. A flight attendant, instead of intervening, offered a hesitant nod in agreement. Economy is just back that way. The subtle humiliation, the unspoken assumption, it simmered beneath the surface of polite smiles. Have you ever been judged, not by your ticket, but by your skin? Share your experiences in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that challenge perception. They didn't ask, they demanded. Step aside, this cabin's not for you. Her boarding pass was scanned, paid in full, her name Eleanor Vance clearly printed on the manifest, but none of that seemed to matter. Not when her skin held the rich hue of dark chocolate. Her posture radiated a quiet confidence, and her silence spoke volumes against their blatant prejudice. A man, his face a roadmap of entitled indignation, sneered as she reached for the overhead bin. "Miss, economy is that way." The flight attendant, a blonde woman with a name tag reading Brenda, didn't correct him. Instead, a tight, almost imperceptible nod of agreement flickered across her face. They were a united front, these arbiters of who belonged and who didn't, humiliating Eleanor in front of a fully boarded first-class cabin. They likely thought they'd get away with it. That this was just another Tuesday, another instance of putting someone in their place. But what they didn't know, what no one in that moment could possibly fathom, was that Eleanor Vance was the last person in the world they should have chosen for their petty display of bigotry. This was the spark, the quiet beginning of a series of events that would unravel perceptions of power, expose the brutal cost of unspoken injustice, and challenge the very fabric of their assumed superiority. This was a moment where disrespect wasn't born of who she was, but out of a willful blindness to who they refused to see. Eleanor Vance was no stranger to airports. The polished floors, the cacophony of rolling luggage, the announcements echoing through the terminals. It was a familiar landscape in her life of constant travel. Nor was she a stranger to the subtle, and sometimes not so subtle glances that came with being a black woman navigating spaces where some people assumed she didn't belong. The cautious stares in upscale boutiques, the lingering attention in exclusive restaurants. She'd learned to carry herself through it all with an unyielding grace. That morning at JFK, nothing about Eleanor's demeanor suggested she was out of place. Her impeccably tailored black pantsuit, the crisp white blouse beneath, the understated elegance of her gold jewelry. It all spoke of a woman accustomed to the finer things in life. Her gait was composed, her carry-on bag a sleek extension of her polished image. Her boarding pass had been scanned without issue at the gate, the confirmation nestled securely within her phone case. The international terminal buzzed with its usual controlled chaos. Announcements in a medley of languages filled the air, a soundtrack to the symphony of travel. The smooth hum of luxury luggage wheels against the marble floors, the polite click of designer heels, the hushed conversations of seasoned travelers. Eleanor moved through it all with practiced ease, a veteran of countless journeys across continents. Paris wasn't a vacation. It was a brief, well-deserved recalibration. A short pause between high-stakes negotiations, the intricate dance of mergers and acquisitions she helped orchestrate from behind the tinted glass of boardrooms most people only dreamed of entering. As she stepped onto the gleaming Skylux aircraft and into the hushed opulence of the first-class cabin, the shift in atmosphere was palpable, though subtle. Eyes flicked upwards from the crisp pages of the Financial Times and the delicate clinking of champagne flutes. Gazes lingered for a fraction too long before returning to the illuminated screens of tablets and phones. For a fleeting moment, even the ambient lighting seemed to dim under the unspoken weight of silent judgment. Eleanor was used to that. The microaggressions, the constant need to prove her worthiness in certain spaces. It was a wearying tax she often had to pay. But what she didn't anticipate was the flight attendant intercepting her halfway down the aisle. "Ma'am, may I see your boarding pass?" Brenda asked, her smile a practiced, almost strained curve of politeness. Her name tag gleamed under the cabin lights. The tone of her voice, however, lacked the genuine warmth one might expect. Eleanor stopped, a slight pause in her confident stride. Other passengers continued to stroll past, their presence unchallenged, their movements unburdened by suspicion. No one else had been asked to produce their credentials. "Sure," Eleanor replied, her voice even and calm, betraying none of the irritation that flickered within her. She retrieved her phone from her elegant leather tote bag, the boarding pass displayed clearly on the screen, and presented it to Brenda. Brenda's eyes scanned the digital pass quickly, her smile faltering almost imperceptibly as she registered the seat assignment 2A, a coveted window suite at the very front of the aircraft. "Thank you," Brenda said, stepping aside with a nod that felt more like a dismissal than an acknowledgement. Eleanor offered a polite, professional smile in return, then continued towards her seat, the soft click of her heels against the carpeted aisle, a quiet counterpoint to the hushed conversations around her. She reached her designated suite and began to stow her bag in the spacious overhead compartment when a voice, laced with presumptuous authority, spoke from behind. "Excuse me, I think you're in the wrong cabin." Eleanor turned, her movements deliberate and unhurried. The speaker was the man from the entryway, now closer, his bulk more imposing. He appeared to be in his late 60s, his face florid, a poorly knotted red power tie askew against his starched white collar. A smug certainty clung to his features, as if he were delivering a self-evident truth. "This is first class," he added, a small, condescending laugh escaping his lips, as though he genuinely believed she had wandered in by mistake. Eleanor didn't respond immediately. She simply met his gaze, her dark eyes steady and unwavering, allowing the silence to hang in the air, thick with unspoken assumptions. Then, she gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, polite, firm and utterly dismissive of his presumptions. "Yes, I know," she stated calmly, her voice carrying a quiet weight that belied his boisterous arrogance. She turned back to her luggage, smoothly slid it into the overhead bin, and settled into the plush leather seat. The man lingered for a moment, clearly thrown off balance by her refusal to engage with his narrative, before muttering something under his breath about entitled people, and lumbering towards his own seat a few rows back. Eleanor kept her expression neutral, her spine straight, her outward composure a carefully constructed shield. But inside, the familiar ache of exhaustion settled in her chest. Not the physical fatigue of travel, but the weariness that came from constant performance, from having to repeatedly prove her belonging in spaces where her presence was questioned, simply because of the color of her skin. Minutes ticked by. A glass of chilled champagne was offered to the man beside her, an aging venture capitalist type in khaki slacks and expensive-looking Bluetooth earbuds, but none was extended to Eleanor. Brenda passed by without a word, her eyes carefully avoiding hers. When another attendant finally did bring a tray of pre-departure beverages, she hesitated at Eleanor's row, her gaze flickering with a hint of uncertainty, as if double-checking her right to be there, before finally handing over a flute of sparkling wine. Eleanor accepted it without comment, her gaze fixed straight ahead, even as her seatmate glanced sideways, pretending not to stare. From her window, she watched the ground crew move with purposeful efficiency around the aircraft, their small, high-visibility vests, like orange chess pieces moving beneath the plane's imposing shadow. She focused on her breath, a simple anchor in the subtle storm of unspoken prejudice. Inhale, exhale. In a few hours the world would tilt back on its axis, where her accomplishments spoke louder than their biases. But for now, here in this pressurized cabin of forced smiles and velvet-lined prejudice, she would wait. The plane had barely begun its taxi towards the runway when Eleanor reached for the touchscreen beside her seat, intending to pull up the in-flight Wi-Fi login and lose herself in a curated playlist that might offer a temporary escape from the lingering weight of the earlier exchange. But as the screen flickered to life, a passenger manifest flashed briefly in the top right corner, part of a new Skylux security interface designed, as their glossy advertisements proclaimed, to verify seating assignments and ensure luxury consistency. Her breath hitched. Her name wasn't there. Where Eleanor Vance should have been, the screen displayed a completely different name, Catherine Donaldson. A knot of confusion tightened in her stomach. Eleanor tapped through the menu, bringing up the full passenger list, then the detailed seating chart. Her own name was nowhere to be found in first class. Her assigned seat, 2A, was listed under the alias Donaldson, while Eleanor Vance had been relegated to a middle seat in row 18C, in economy. The irony hit her with a bitter, sharp sting. The system had quite literally moved her to the back of the plane, disregarding her physical presence, her printed boarding pass, and her paid confirmation. It was a digital manifestation of the very prejudice she had just experienced. A few seconds later, Brenda reappeared, that same tight smile already beginning to strain at the corners. "Yes, miss." "Vance," Eleanor corrected calmly, turning the touchscreen slightly so Brenda could see the discrepancy. "My name isn't on the manifest for this cabin. I'm being listed in seat 8. Brenda's eyes flicked to the screen, then back to Eleanor, a flicker of something unreadable crossing her face. She hesitated for a moment, then offered a dismissive shrug. "Oh, that's just a minor display error. It happens sometimes. You're perfectly fine where you are." But her tone held a thinly veiled discomfort, and Eleanor noted the way she avoided full eye contact. "A display error that only applies to me?" Eleanor asked, her voice low, calm, but with an edge of steel that could cut through pretense. Brenda drew a slow, deliberate breath. "Like I said, it's not a big deal. Let me just double-check with the purser." Then, without waiting for a reply, she turned and hurried towards the front of the cabin. Meanwhile, across the aisle and 2 rows back, a passenger in his early 30s, a hooded sweatshirt pulled low over his brow, his phone angled discreetly in his lap, had already begun recording. His lens followed Eleanor's interaction with Brenda like a hawk trailing its prey. The live stream picked up muffled fragments of their conversation, and within seconds, he was narrating softly to his unseen audience. "Yo, check this out, y'all. Homegirl's chilling in first class, but now she's saying the system got her name wrong. I swear, every flight these days is a whole reality show. I think we got one of those Karen in reverse moments brewing." Eleanor remained oblivious to her burgeoning online notoriety. She only knew that the air in the cabin had grown subtly thinner, as if someone had slowly turned down the oxygen a notch. She sat with her hands folded calmly in her lap, her breathing slow and even, her composure held firm, like a dam holding back a surge of frustration. Every muscle in her body remained controlled, even as her instincts screamed at the injustice of the situation. She knew the pattern. First, the questioning of her presence. Then, the undermining of her legitimacy. The next step, she suspected, would be escalation. Never loud, never overtly aggressive, always wrapped in the guise of procedure. 10 minutes crawled by before Brenda returned, now accompanied by a male flight supervisor in his mid-40s, silver-rimmed glasses perched on his nose, a smile that had clearly been trained into placid submission by years of corporate policy meetings. "Ms. Vance," he began, his tone carefully neutral, "I understand there's been some concern regarding your seating record." Eleanor turned to him, her gaze direct. "There is no concern. There is a system error showing I'm not supposed to be here, despite all evidence, my boarding pass, my confirmation proving otherwise." The supervisor nodded, a practiced gesture that suggested agreement, but belied his subsequent words. "We just want to ensure you're comfortable. If you prefer, we can escort you to 18C, where the manifest currently places your name, just as a precaution, until we get the system updated." That was it. The moment they tried to nudge her backward, figuratively and literally, cloaking their prejudice in a veneer of helpfulness, Eleanor leaned slightly forward, her voice still calm but laced with an unmistakable edge. "So, let me get this straight. Your solution to a glitch is to pretend I didn't pay for this seat, didn't check in, didn't get assigned here with a confirmed boarding pass, and move me to the back of the plane for appearances." The man hesitated, his smile faltering for the first time. Behind him, Eleanor saw Brenda's jaw tighten, almost imperceptibly. "No, not at all," he offered quickly. "It's about order, Miss Vance. Just for now." Eleanor didn't smile. "Then order better," she replied coldly. What had started as a simple system error was now mutating quietly and efficiently into something far more calculated. Eleanor knew this dance all too well. First they questioned your right to be there. Then they chipped away at your legitimacy. The next step was always escalation. Never loud, never obvious. Always shrouded in the language of protocol. So, when the man in the navy blue security blazer entered the cabin mid-boarding, Eleanor didn't flinch. He had that heavy, purposeful walk that security agents adopted when they were about to do something they had no intention of fully explaining. His badge gleamed dully beneath the embroidered words Port Authority Aviation Division. His eyes scanned the first-class rows, and he made a beeline for her. He didn't smile. He didn't introduce himself. He simply leaned in, his face impassive, and asked flatly, "Ma'am, may I see a second form of identification?" Eleanor looked up at him, her face composed, her fingers still resting lightly on the armrest. "Is there a reason?" she asked, her tone matching his in quiet resolve. The man's gaze didn't waver. "We've been alerted to a discrepancy involving your boarding record. It's standard protocol to confirm identity in situations like these." The lie was clean, practiced, measured in every syllable. Eleanor reached into her purse and silently handed over her passport. He took it, his eyes flicking between the photo and her face, as if searching for some inconsistency that wasn't there. "Do you have any proof of purchase for your ticket?" he added, his tone demanding. Eleanor blinked once, then slowly pulled up the Skylux app on her phone, her thumb navigating to the reservation details. Eleanor Vance, seat 2A confirmed. The screen clearly displayed. She held it out to him. He barely glanced at it. "I'll be right back," he said, and walked away without returning her passport. Passengers openly watched now, no longer bothering to conceal their curiosity. The man in khakis from earlier smirked from behind his tablet, as if his initial assessment had been definitively validated. A few seats behind Eleanor, a middle-aged couple exchanged whispers, the woman mouthing words like scam and fraud behind a manicured hand. The pressure was building, a palpable tension in the confined space, but not in Eleanor's voice, not in her body language. She sat still, her spine ramrod straight, her breath slow and deliberate, her mind working 2-3 steps ahead. If they wanted to turn this into a public spectacle, they would soon regret underestimating the kind of image she could project. Meanwhile, at the front of the cabin, a different scene was unfolding. The same Brenda who had questioned Eleanor twice now stood at the cockpit entrance, her smile wide and welcoming as she gestured for a group of white passengers, 3 men and 1 woman, all in impeccably tailored coats and adorned with diamond-studded watches, to approach the flight deck. "Captain Michaels is absolutely thrilled to welcome our VIPs for a quick tour before takeoff," Brenda chirped, her eyes sparkling with an almost fawning enthusiasm. Soft laughter echoed from the front as they posed for photos with the pilots, hands resting casually on shoulders, champagne flutes clinking just outside the forbidden threshold of the cockpit door. Eleanor noticed it all. Not once had anyone offered her the same courtesy. Not once had the word VIP been uttered in her direction. Even though her net worth could likely eclipse the combined wealth of the group at the front, her presence wasn't questioned because she was dressed poorly or lacked composure. It was questioned because people who looked like her were still viewed as exceptions, only legitimate when publicly validated. And a quiet black woman with her own first-class seat, her own wealth, and her own unwavering calm didn't fit the preconceived notions of those who had built their entire sense of self on being the default. 10 minutes later, the security agent returned, his face a carefully constructed mask of neutrality. "Everything checks out," he stated, handing back her passport as if it were a contaminated object. "You're free to remain in your seat." Eleanor took it silently. No apology followed, no explanation, just the soft shuffle of his shoes disappearing down the aisle, and the lingering cold weight of unchallenged authority left behind. The passengers who had been watching quickly averted their gazes, retreating back into their privileged bubbles of ignorance, pretending they hadn't just witnessed an attempted erasure. The man in khakis met her gaze briefly, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, then looked down at his phone. He didn't smirk this time. Brenda passed through once more, offering plush towels and warm nuts to the VIP group, now returned from their exclusive cockpit experience. She bypassed Eleanor's row entirely, though the security officer had returned her passport and confirmed her right to be in seat 2A. The atmosphere around Eleanor hadn't relaxed. If anything, it had calcified into something more insidious, silent consensus. No one apologized. No one acknowledged the blatant error. The damage wasn't procedural. It was social, and it felt deeply intentional. From the corner of her eye, Eleanor noticed Brenda approach again, this time accompanied by another uniformed crew member. A young man Eleanor hadn't seen before. His expression was blank, his movements stiff, protocol frozen onto his brow. "Miss Vance," Brenda began, her voice tight and a shade too loud, the forced cheerfulness now completely absent. "We're going to need you to collect your belongings and deplane while we finalize a few last-minute confirmations." Eleanor didn't move. "I've already been confirmed twice by security." "By you?" Brenda's smile twitched, faltering under the pressure. "We understand that, but we've received a directive to reprocess your boarding documentation." The phrase hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Directive, reprocess, words carefully chosen to sound official but ultimately devoid of any legitimate meaning. A voice 2 rows behind muttered, "Here we go again." Another passenger snorted softly. Eleanor could feel the subtle shift in the cabin's energy, the almost imperceptible rise in anticipation that came when an audience sensed they were about to be entertained at someone else's expense. She remained seated. "And if I refuse?" she asked evenly. Brenda's tone hardened, the veneer of customer service finally cracking. "Then we'll be forced to involve terminal security. You can either come voluntarily, or—" The rest of the sentence didn't need to be spoken. Eleanor took a slow, deliberate breath. Her entire career had been built on negotiation, on finding solutions through dialogue, not through public spectacle. But this wasn't a boardroom, this was theatre, and she was being cast in a role she had not auditioned for. Carefully, deliberately, she reached for her elegant leather tote, rose gracefully to her feet, and stepped out into the aisle. Silence followed her like a shadow. Every pair of eyes in first class turned. Some widened in smug satisfaction, their biases confirmed. Others narrowed in disapproval, a flicker of unease in their gaze. One or two, perhaps, flickered with a fleeting hint of shame. But none spoke up. As she walked towards the exit, the man in business casual a few rows back pulled out his phone and began filming, his camera following her progress, as if she were a perp walk on Wall Street. Eleanor kept her shoulders squared, her head held high. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. But that didn't stop them from trying. As she reached the jet bridge, another man, mid-20s, with slicked back hair and the obnoxious energy of a failed influencer, stepped directly into her path, his phone already recording, a wide, self-satisfied smirk plastered across his face. "Hey, quick question," he said, a forced chuckle bubbling beneath his words. "How does it feel to get kicked off a flight you couldn't afford?" His voice dripped with mock innocence, but the underlying malice was unmistakable. One of those equal access lawsuits waiting to happen, or just a simple misunderstanding. Eleanor stopped just short of him, her gaze locking onto his for one long pointed second that seemed to deflate his smugness. Then, without uttering a single word, she turned and continued walking towards the terminal. Behind her, he chuckled louder, speaking directly into the lens of his phone like a tabloid reporter. "No comment, folks. That's the sound of someone who knows they got caught pretending to be someone they're not." His voice faded as she stepped into the sterile hallway, but the damage was done. The clip would be edited, posted, dissected, and devoured by a voyeuristic online world, stripped of context, devoid of truth, and designed solely to humiliate. It wasn't about what she had said, it was about how they could twist her silence into an admission of guilt. Outside the aircraft, a junior gate agent stood waiting beside a Skylux representative, holding a tablet, both avoiding eye contact. "Miss Vance," the gate agent mumbled, his voice rehearsed and falsely apologetic. "We're just reviewing a few things internally. If you'd kindly wait in the boarding area, we'll issue an update shortly." Eleanor stared at him, her expression unreadable. "Am I being removed for any confirmed infraction?" she asked, her voice calm but demanding a clear answer. The man hesitated, shifting his weight uncomfortably. "No, ma'am. Just a technicality." "So, this is a delay based on inconvenience?" Eleanor pressed, her gaze unwavering. He offered a weak, placating smile, as if that could somehow smooth over the egregious situation. "It's just procedure." Eleanor's silence hung in the air, cutting deeper than any accusation she could have voiced. And now, here she was, seated in a quiet, glass-enclosed section of the terminal, surrounded by nothing but the muffled sounds of airport activity and the dull ache of clarity. Her phone lay dark in her lap, unread messages accumulating from her assistant, her legal counsel, and her executive director, none of which she had yet felt compelled to answer. She stared through the terminal window at the Skylux aircraft that had so unceremoniously ejected her. It was still parked at the gate, the jet bridge reconnected, a ground crew member walking with hurried purpose towards the cockpit. Something was clearly amiss. Inside the cabin, a different kind of tension had taken hold. The flight, which had been cleared for pushback, had suddenly halted just as its wheels began to turn. The engine spooled down, a low whine that faded into an unsettling silence. Overhead lights flickered once, and then a chime rang through the aircraft. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking," a voice came over the intercom, calm but with a clipped undertone. "We've encountered a minor systems issue, and we'll be holding here at the gate while our ground crew investigates. We appreciate your patience." Passengers groaned, some sighing loudly, others rolling their eyes. Champagne glasses clinked with nervous energy, and phones were quickly retrieved. But in row 3A, The man with silver hair and a navy pin-striped suit leaned forward slowly, squinting out the window at the woman now sitting behind the glass in the terminal. He nudged the man next to him, a fellow distinguished businessman with a Wall Street Journal folded under his arm. "Frank," he muttered, his voice low and urgent. "You see that woman sitting in the lounge?" Frank glanced out the window, following the man's gaze, and gave a nonchalant shrug. "Yeah, what about her?" The first man frowned, tapping his temple with 2 fingers. "I've seen her before, a couple of years back, I think. San Diego, the International CEO Summit. You remember the one where they had that keynote on cybersecurity and infrastructure collapse?" Frank nodded slowly, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. "Yeah, I was there." The first man leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. She was one of the panelists. Eleanor Vance, founder of PulseCore Ventures. She built the damn thing from scratch after leaving Langford Capital. Frank blinked, his casual demeanor evaporating. "PulseCore? That's the firm that just closed the data contract with Homeland Security, right?" The first man nodded grimly. "And Lockridge Defense. You think she's flying commercial for fun?" Frank looked again at the composed figure in the lounge. Her posture ramrod straight, her face unreadable, his mouth parted slightly. "Oh hell." Back in the cabin, murmurs began to spread like wildfire. "The system glitch," someone whispered. "I heard it's about the manifest. They're reviewing security protocols now. You know they made that woman leave, right? The one who was sitting in 2. Yeah. They just pulled her off the plane with no explanation. I heard she didn't belong here. Nah, someone said she's actually the owner of a cybersecurity firm." "Wait, was that Eleanor Vance at the front of the plane earlier?" Brenda stood frozen near the cockpit entrance. As the pilot stepped out, his face a mask of professional concern. "We've just been contacted by the airline's compliance team," he said, his voice low and serious. "Apparently, there's been a request to review passenger handling on this flight." Immediately, Brenda stiffened. "Captain, I followed standard procedure." The captain didn't blink. "Apparently not." He turned to the co-pilot. "Hold boarding. This plane isn't going anywhere until we get a resolution." The co-pilot picked up the radio, relaying instructions to the tarmac crew. The sound of latches unlocking and hydraulics hissing followed, as the boarding door reopened once more. Outside the aircraft, Eleanor still hadn't moved. She saw the jet bridge reconnecting and raised a single elegant eyebrow. Nothing more. The gate agent reappeared beside her, pale and visibly nervous now. "Mrs. Vance, there may have been an error in judgment. Our compliance department has requested a follow-up. Would you mind stepping back aboard for a few minutes?" Eleanor didn't speak. She simply rose, smoothing the lapels of her perfectly tailored blazer, and followed him with a quiet grace that spoke volumes without uttering a single word. It was a subtle power, not loud or chaotic, but it carried an undeniable weight. Conversations quieted in the gate area. Expressions shifted from curious to apprehensive. Even Brenda, who had carried herself with such brutal confidence earlier, visibly tensed as Eleanor approached her row. The man in 3A whispered to Frank again, his voice a low, awestruck threat. "She's back on. I knew it. We're about to see some real turbulence, but not the kind you feel at 30,000 feet. Brenda took a single, hesitant step towards Eleanor, her voice forced into a semblance of diplomatic politeness. "Mrs. Vance, we'd be happy to reseat you if you'd prefer a more private cabin." Or, Eleanor cut her off with a simple, unwavering look. "I'll return to 2A. Her tone wasn't hostile. It was precise, clean, like honed steel." Brenda nodded quickly, stepping aside as Eleanor slid smoothly back into her seat and placed her bag beneath the console. She didn't have to reclaim her position. Her very presence did that for her. A few rows back, in the service alcove behind the first-class galley, Grace, the youngest flight attendant on board, stood rigid beside Brenda, her voice hushed but urgent. "Are we sure this is the same Eleanor Vance from PulseCore?" Brenda gave her a sharp, annoyed glance, but a flicker of uncertainty danced in her eyes. "It doesn't matter who she is," Brenda muttered, though the earlier confidence had noticeably drained from her words. Grace hesitated, her brows drawn together in something more than just concern. "It kind of does," she said quietly. "I mean, that's $1 billion firm. She's been in Forbes. She was just on a panel with the Treasury Secretary last month. I saw the video." Brenda didn't reply, but Eleanor saw the almost imperceptible stiffening of her spine, the subtle tightening of her grip on the beverage cart. She straightened her blouse and turned away. But the nervous shift in her posture betrayed everything. The power dynamics were shifting, and Brenda knew it. Meanwhile, the man in seat 2B, white, early 40s, clean-shaven with a discreet monogram on his dress shirt cuff, was already back in work mode, his laptop unfolded, his fingers gliding across the trackpad. He had said nothing when Eleanor returned, just offered a tight, almost apologetic nod. But as his screen lit up, his brow furrowed almost instantly. He stared at the presentation slide on his screen, an internal report from a recent cybersecurity briefing, then looked again closer. At the top corner of the slide was a sleek, minimalist logo in electric blue, Pulse Core Ventures. His eyes darted to Eleanor, then back to the screen. He clicked through to another slide, one that quoted a direct remark. Brooks recommends phased deployment of advanced behavioral encryption by Q4. The quote was time-stamped. It was hers. The man sat back in his plush seat, blinking slowly. He was preparing a strategy proposal built on the very technological infrastructure of the woman sitting right next to him. A bead of sweat formed near his temple. He shifted uncomfortably, opened his mouth slightly as if to speak, then thought better of it and quietly closed his laptop instead. Eleanor didn't react. She had seen the screen, the logo, the quote. She had also seen the flicker of embarrassment, bordering on panic, that had crawled across his face. But she offered nothing, not a smirk, not a nod, not even a fleeting glance of acknowledgement. She simply kept her gaze forward, her fingers calmly adjusting the angle of the reading light above her. Across the aisle, whispers had begun to stir again, but this time they weren't laced with mockery. They were filled with a mixture of curiosity and even a hint of reverence. "Did you hear she's the founder of PulseCore? The one they made leave earlier? You're kidding. No way. Someone up just Googled her. It's all real. Wait, that's why the pilot delayed the flight. She's not just a CEO, she's the CEO." Grace returned to her station, biting her lip, her hands trembling slightly as she poured mineral water into delicate crystal tumblers. "They're all talking," she whispered to another junior attendant, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. "They know who she is now." The other woman glanced towards the vent, where Eleanor sat composed and unreadable. "What's Brenda going to do?" Grace shook her head, her gaze fixed on the closed cockpit door. "Nothing. It's too late for Brenda." Eleanor could feel the weight of their gazes brushing against her skin like static electricity. Whispers circulated like wind currents, carrying fragments of her name, her real name, now spoken in hushed tones instead of being omitted, erased or questioned. People had started to understand who she was, but knowing was one thing. Witnessing what came next was another. Just as the captain re-entered the cockpit to prepare for relaunch, a sudden sharp knock echoed from the still-open cabin door. Brenda turned towards it, confusion momentarily crossing her face. Standing at the threshold was a sharply dressed woman in a fitted black suit, a tablet clutched in her hand, flanked by two men in tailored grey, their tall, square shoulders radiating an air of quiet authority, discreet earpieces in place, their movements betraying the effortless discipline of executive security. The woman in black leaned forward and spoke to the stunned gate agent in a clipped, professional tone. "We're here for Miss Eleanor Vance." The gate agent blinked, his earlier forced politeness completely dissolved. Brenda's mouth parted slightly as she took a small involuntary step forward, then immediately froze as she saw Eleanor rise slowly from her seat. Without uttering a word, Eleanor gathered her belongings with a calm, deliberate grace that didn't demand attention. It commanded it. The security men stepped aside respectfully, and the woman with the tablet gave a firm, almost imperceptible nod. "Everything's ready, ma'am." Eleanor turned to face the passengers, the crew, the captain now emerging again from the cockpit, and most of all Brenda, who stood frozen near the beverage cart, her hands clenched together in front of her, like a schoolgirl who had just realized she had failed the most important exam of her life. Eleanor's voice, when she finally spoke, was low, clear, and imbued with a quiet authority that silenced the remaining whispers. "Before we proceed," she stated, taking a single measured step forward, every head in first class turning towards her, even those in the back rows craning their necks into the aisle, "I believe a clarification is in order. My name is Eleanor Vance," she continued, her gaze sweeping across the stunned faces in the cabin. "I am the founder and CEO of PulseCore Ventures." A beat of silence hung in the air, thick and heavy. "And as of 9 hours in AM this morning, Eleanor continued, her voice gaining a subtle, steely resonance. Pulsecore finalized the acquisition of a controlling 51% stake in Skylux Airlines. This includes this aircraft, its flight operations, and the employment contracts of every single person on board. A silence fell so deep it was almost physical. The man in 3A exhaled loudly, a whoosh of disbelief. The younger executive with the laptop audibly gasped, his face paling. Grace, in the galley, stood frozen, her lips parted, her hand instinctively flying to cover her mouth. Brenda didn't speak, didn't blink, her eyes wide and glassy, as if all the light had suddenly been extinguished behind them. Eleanor didn't stop. This flight and its handling of me will be audited. Every decision made by this crew from boarding to the moment I was asked to deplane has been recorded and filed. Your systems, your staffing, your code of conduct, all of it will be reviewed against the standards you promised to your shareholders, and more importantly, to your passengers. Her gaze landed briefly on the man with the camera phone, now holding it limply at his side, the self-satisfied smirk completely gone, a dawning awareness of the gravity of the moment, replacing his earlier smugness. "Let me be clear," Eleanor continued, her voice unwavering. "I did not come here to make a scene. I came here to travel. What followed was not a misunderstanding. It was a systemic failure, one that ends today." The passengers sat stiffly in their plush seats. The once vibrant buzz of privilege and routine, now replaced by a collective understanding that something irreversible had just unfolded. Brenda still hadn't moved, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched the side of the beverage cart, her knuckles white. Grace stood behind her, no longer trying to conceal the nervous glances she sent down the aisle, while the younger attendant near the galley leaned close to whisper, "Did she really say she owns the airline?" Grace didn't respond, just nodded once, her lips pressed into a thin line of disbelief. Meanwhile, the captain had already picked up the satellite phone, speaking quietly with someone beyond the confines of the cockpit, his voice tight but deferential. He knew who held command now. 2 minutes later, Eleanor reappeared, walking with even more precision than before, flanked by her executive assistant, Elena, a woman in her mid-30s, in a sharp charcoal grey sheath dress, a leather portfolio tucked under her arm, and one of the two security personnel, who remained a respectful step behind her, silent but undeniably present. She paused near the cockpit entrance. "Captain," she said clearly, her voice carrying a new weight of authority, "please delay departure until further notice. This aircraft is no longer cleared for takeoff under internal compliance review." The captain, still holding the receiver to his ear, gave a quick decisive nod. "Understood, Miss Vance." She didn't offer a smile. Turning towards the stunned cabin, she spoke in a tone measured not by emotion, but by finality. "Elena, begin verification." Elena opened her portfolio and produced a folded document, crisp and tabbed. "Effective immediately," she announced, her voice clear and authoritative as she addressed the front crew station. "Skylux Internal Oversight, under the direction of Pulsecore Ventures, is commencing a crew audit on Flight 207. All personnel please remain at your assigned posts. This process is non-negotiable." Her voice rang clear, unaffected by the palpable tension that gripped the cabin like invisible turbulence. Brenda instinctively stepped forward, her voice catching in her throat. No one told us this was happening today." Eleanor turned to her, her gaze direct and unwavering, with a surgical calm that was far more intimidating than any outburst. "No one needed to. We were observing behavior. The decision to activate this review was made an hour ago, based entirely on the conduct I personally experienced." Brenda opened her mouth again, a protest forming on her lips, but no sound emerged. Eleanor held her gaze for only a moment longer, making it unequivocally clear that the conversation was over before it had truly begun. Across the aisle, murmurs rippled through the passengers again, but now they carried a completely different tone, less gossip, more awe, tinged with a nervous uncertainty. Passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, watching what felt like the unraveling of established power in real time. In 3A, the older businessman leaned towards his colleague, his previous smugness replaced by a hushed respect. "I don't think she's just here to fly," he whispered. "She's making an example." And Eleanor wasn't finished. She walked calmly to the galley, where two junior flight crew members stood frozen, their faces etched with apprehension. She scanned their name tags without waiting for permission, her eyes sharp and discerning. Then, turning back towards Elena, she said, her voice carrying a quiet weight. Please notify legal to terminate all ongoing procurement negotiations with Eastgate Logistics Group. Elena blinked, but offered no questions. She retrieved her phone and made the call instantly, her fingers moving with swift efficiency. Brenda's head shot up at the mention of the name, the words clearly triggering something significant. Her lips parted as if to protest, but she hesitated, visibly wrestling with something deeper than mere shock. Eleanor saw the internal struggle. I believe, she said, her voice quieter now but no less sharp, that Eastgate Logistics was expecting to sign a $400 million contract with Skylux in 2 days' time. That contract, I understand, was contingent upon a number of factors, including a certain internal referral from a member of this flight crew. Brenda's face paled visibly, the heat of realization spreading across her skin like a sudden fever. Passengers had completely abandoned any pretense of disinterest. Every head was turned now, all eyes fixed on the unfolding drama. One man discreetly started recording again, but this time not with mockery. There was a sense of witnessing something historic, something significant. She's killing the contract, someone whispered, his voice filled with awe. That's $400 million. She's cutting ties with Brenda's guy, another voice added, a knowing tone in the hushed words. Her boyfriend's on Eastgate's board. I heard her bragging about it earlier. The live stream footage from earlier, once dismissed as just another anonymous clip, meant to mock a black woman for causing a scene, had already been unearthed, reframed, and distributed across the internet by digital watchdogs, activists, journalists, and thousands of furious viewers who instantly recognized the injustice of what the crew had done. Edited side by side with Eleanor's on-record Forbes interview, where she calmly discussed ethical leadership and corporate transparency. The clip now carried a devastating new caption, "This is how you treat the woman who owns the airline." Within minutes, the hashtag #SkyLuxExposed surged to the top trending topics on X and TikTok. Common threads flooded social media, filled with outrage and demands for accountability pouring in from all corners of the globe. Business leaders, equity advocates, even major Skylux shareholders themselves were publicly condemning the incident. Inside the cabin, the captain had just received a second call, this time not from operations, but directly from Skylux's board liaison. His face grew stiff, his eyes scanning the closed cockpit door as though it was suddenly made of transparent glass. He emerged calmly, but his stride had changed. There was a newfound urgency in his movements. He approached Eleanor, who stood quietly near the galley, reviewing the ordered documentation Elena was meticulously compiling. "Ms. Vance," he said, his voice lower now, more measured, tinged with a deference that hadn't been present before. "The board has confirmed your full authority in this matter. You have complete discretion regarding personnel suspension pending formal investigation." Eleanor didn't look up from the page she was signing, her pen moving with swift precision. "Good," she said simply. "Begin with the crew members listed here." She handed over the printed sheet, already bearing her signature. Names were clearly marked. Brenda Hastings, lead flight attendant; Marcus Lindell, secondary cabin support; Trent Monroe, passenger relations supervisor, each accompanied by a brief, damning description of their conduct. Repeated denial of verified identification, public humiliation of passenger without cause, failure to correct manifest error, willful neglect of duty to de-escalate. Words spread through the remaining crew like a contagion. Trent, who had been pacing nervously by the service station, stopped mid-step when he saw the captain hand Brenda the official suspension notice. She read it in silence, her face slowly draining of color as the full weight of the reality crashed down upon her. Grace stood nearby, silent but watching, a mixture of shock and a grim sense of justice in her eyes. Brenda turned to her instinctively, searching for some semblance of support, but found none. Grace's eyes offered no pity, only a stark distance. Outside the aircraft, reporters had already begun to gather near Skylux's main terminal entrance. Someone from the airline's communications team, likely tipped off by internal leaks, had already contacted the press. Now they couldn't stop the bleeding. Financial analysts, catching wind of the scandal's explosive momentum, began circulating early projections. A 6% dip in Skylux's stock within the first hour, then 9%, then a staggering 13% before the close of the market. By evening, major news outlets were broadcasting live, the headlines stark and unforgiving. Breaking: Skylux Airlines faces discrimination scandal. after CEO Eleanor Vance removed from own plane. The amateur footage spoke for itself. So did the rapidly plummeting numbers. International investors began pulling inquiries, legal firms drafted statements, and the Federal Aviation Administration's Compliance Division issued a formal announcement of review, citing potential violations of FAA policy, racial bias protocols, and consumer protection laws. Back inside the plane, Eleanor finally took her seat again, not because she needed to prove anything further, but simply because it was hers. No one dared to speak as she calmly adjusted her seatbelt. Elena returned to her side and whispered, her voice low, "Media wants a statement." Eleanor nodded once, her gaze fixed straight ahead. "They'll get one after this flight arrives, on my terms." She looked out the window, her expression calm and resolute, as if the entire storm raging outside were nothing more than distant, inconsequential weather. Brenda sat near the rear of the first-class cabin now, no longer in her crisp uniform, stripped of her badge, her ID clipped face down on her lap. She stared blankly ahead, her lips slightly parted, the weight of her sudden downfall crashing in relentless waves. She couldn't comprehend it. She had built her sense of self on order, on control, on the perceived hierarchy of hospitality. But that hierarchy had shattered, and the person she had so casually dismissed had stepped through the wreckage without even breaking stride. By the time the engines roared to life again and the plane finally taxied away from the gate, the atmosphere in the cabin had undergone a profound transformation. The silence that had once been thick with judgment and unspoken prejudice was now shaped by a mixture of reverence, apprehension, and quiet reflection. Eleanor sat motionless in 2A, her posture relaxed but not detached, her presence still commanding but devoid of any hint of vindictiveness. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't made threats. She had simply acted, and in doing so, she had dismantled an entire narrative. As the cabin climbed towards cruising altitude, Grace lingered in the galley, her hands fidgeting nervously with a folded linen napkin, her breath catching in her throat every time she glanced down the aisle towards the front. Finally, after an internal battle that had been building since Eleanor's first steps onto the plane, she set the napkin down, straightened her spine, and walked slowly towards the first-class section. When she reached Eleanor's row, she paused, her throat tight, her face pale with a mixture of shame and trepidation. "Miss Vance," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor turned her gaze towards her, her expression neutral but attentive. Grace swallowed hard. I didn't say anything earlier. I should have. I saw how they treated you, and I froze. I was scared of Brenda, of losing my job, but that's not an excuse. It was wrong." Her voice cracked slightly. "And I'm sorry." Eleanor watched her in silence for a long moment, her eyes searching, assessing. Then she nodded once, slowly. "Don't apologize to me," she said gently, her voice carrying a surprising warmth. "Apologize to the next person, by standing up for them when it counts." Grace's eyes welled with tears. She nodded quickly, then stepped away, holding her breath as if afraid that even kindness might shatter under the lingering tension. Later that month, as the headlines evolved from a sensational scandal to a period of system-wide introspection within the airline industry, a clip from a modest podcast began to circulate online. The show, titled Inside Out, usually featured low-profile guests from the aviation world, cabin crew, retired pilots, hospitality consultants. But that week, it featured a face the world had already seen far too well: Brenda Hastings, former Skylux lead flight attendant. Her posture was subdued, the haughty stiffness gone. She sat in front of the microphone, her eyes clearer than before, her voice stripped of its former sharp precision. "I've been thinking about everything that happened," she said quietly, her gaze fixed on some unseen point beyond the recording equipment. "And I've come to accept something I didn't want to admit." She took a long, steadying breath. It wasn't just unconscious bias, it was pride, it was entitlement. It was the deeply ingrained belief that because someone didn't fit the image I had in my head of who belonged in a certain place, they simply didn't belong. And that belief cost me everything. The host leaned forward, his voice gentle. "If you could say one thing to Eleanor Vance now, what would it be?" Brenda hesitated, her throat working as she swallowed. A raw emotion flickered across her face. "Thank you," she finally whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Thank you for not destroying me when you so easily could have, for showing me what true power, wielded with dignity, really looks like. She paused, then added, the regret palpable in her tone. And I sincerely hope I never forget the lesson that taught me. Meanwhile, PulseCore's strategic review of Skylux's diversity and inclusion policies led to sweeping reforms: the implementation of anonymous grievance reporting systems, quarterly equity audits, and mandatory unconscious bias training programs for all flight crew and ground staff. A month after the incident, Eleanor stood on a stage at the Global Ethics Forum in Zurich, addressing an audience of thousands. Behind her, on a massive screen, projected in bold white letters, was a quote: "Justice doesn't always arrive in fury. Sometimes it arrives in silence, but it leaves thunder behind." She spoke without notes, her voice clear and resonant, filling the vast hall. "What happened to me on that flight wasn't new," she told the rapt audience. "What was new was that I had the power to respond differently. And power isn't just about using your voice. It's about choosing when to speak and when to let silence carry the message." Her words struck deeply, not because they were emotionally charged, but because they resonated with an undeniable truth. Weeks later, a young black woman boarded a Skylux flight to Tokyo. She wore a simple T-shirt that read, "Belonging isn't a privilege, it's a right." As she walked past the first-class cabin, a flight attendant greeted her warmly, a genuine smile on her face, and didn't ask for her boarding pass twice. She found her seat in economy. No one questioned her presence. And somewhere in a quiet office, overlooking a bustling cityscape, Eleanor Vance read a brief update on her phone. Skylux stock had stabilized, PulseCore's influence within the airline was steadily growing, and diversity metrics within the company had shown a significant encouraging surge. She placed the phone down, a small, almost imperceptible smile gracing her lips as she looked out her window. Not because she had won, but because the system, in its own small way, had been made just a little bit better than the one she had been forced to navigate. That story, at its heart, reminds us that our assumptions about others can be deeply flawed and even harmful. It highlights the quiet strength in standing your ground and the profound impact of holding people accountable for their biases. In our own lives, it calls on us to be more mindful of our own unconscious prejudices and to speak up against injustice, even in subtle forms. What moments in the story resonated most with you, and how might you apply those lessons? Share your thoughts below. I'm genuinely curious to hear your perspectives. If this story sparked something in you, hit that like button and subscribe for more narratives that make us think and connect.